because most of you haven't seen it. So welcome back to another episode of Medical AI or Unfiltered AI Leadership. I'm Haris Shuaib. I'm founder and CEO of Newton's Tree, and I have the good pleasure as part of this series to talk with AI leaders across the space, including in frontline clinical practice, innovation and policy as well. Today I'm joined by an old colleague, Rob Turpin from the British Standards Institute, and we're going to be discussing really how standards shape the digital health ecosystem and the medical AI landscape in particular. So let's kick off first, Rob, with an introduction. For those who don't know about your work, tell us a bit about who you are, your role at the BSI, and how you got involved in medtech and digital health standards.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to do this. It's an absolute honour, and it's great to see you again. My name's Rob Turpin, so I'm Head of Sector for Healthcare at BSI, and specifically the part of BSI which is the UK national standards body. Now, in that role, we develop and publish standards across lots and lots of different sectors and domains and areas. And I'm involved in the healthcare space. There's about half a dozen sectors that we pull out because they've got a key importance in terms of standardisation. And particularly in the healthcare space, we do a lot of work around standards to support the regulation and the adoption of medical technologies.
Yep.
We do a lot in the digital health and the informatics space as well. So when you get to topics such as AI and how it's deployed in healthcare, actually that's right at the centre of what we do. And a big chunk of my time is spent on engagement. It's finding out what are the big challenges and barriers in healthcare relating to technology and to digital solutions, and how standards can help overcome some of those things.
And how did you get involved personally?
How did I get involved?
Yeah.
I've had a very long career at BSI. So my degree is actually in chemical engineering.
Okay.
So a totally different area. I've never specifically worked in the healthcare sector until I came to BSI.
And is that something you did straight from graduation?
Pretty much. I had a little bit of time, first of all, working in sort of an engineering sales environment. And round about 2001, I was looking for a bit of a change. So I've been at BSI now for almost 24 years, which is unbelievable when I think about it, because I'm not sure. But my role has changed in that time. So I started off in an engineering role running standardisation committees.
Okay.
I moved to doing some of the international work we do, so where BSI facilitates international standards, and we'll probably come on to that a bit more later on. Moved into line management, and then probably 10, 12 years ago, I had an opportunity to start getting involved in sort of more of a sector development, market development role. And that's, healthcare was the one that came along at the time. So I wasn't so much focused on going straight for the healthcare sector, but that was the opportunity that came up, and I've stuck with that ever since.
Interesting. So it's super helpful to understand the BSI's work across those sectors. And you've been in digital health and medtech for those 24 years?
Not the whole time, but probably the last 12, 13.
Interesting. And what's been particularly unique or challenging when it comes to standardization in this field?
I think there's a few things. So for me, the relationship between the supplier and the NHS as providers has always been, I wouldn't say poor, but I think it's not always what it could be.
Poor as in not productive or something else?
I think sometimes we see duplication, confusion, people not understanding the supplier from the provider side, and potentially vice versa as well.
Does it work well in other sectors? Or is there a sector that comes to mind where you're like, sort of the buyer, commissioner and vendor relationship is better?
I think there are, I think genuinely there are other sectors where it's easier.
Yeah.
One of the challenges with healthcare is just the enormity of our National Health Service. With over a million employees, and just such a huge structure. As a small team based in Chiswick running the standards division, we have to be really, really selective about what we can cover and what we can't do.
And so then, what do you end up focusing on then, or what have you been focusing on?
So quite early on, we started to realise that actually the real sort of touch point for us where we should be focusing was around the innovation piece in medical technology.
Yeah.
And obviously digital health is a function of that. So I would say that's where we've had the most success.
Yeah.
A lot of our standards in the medtech space are quite mature. So they're probably all on their third or fourth iteration by now. They're all well established, they're all well used. So by the time they come up for review or revision, we're looking at really small incremental changes. The really exciting bit is to look at the digital transformation and where that's used as a technology to advance healthcare. Because actually, I think that's where you see the biggest challenges, the most confusion, people needing help, groups needing to agree what good looks like.
Yeah.
So that's the bit we've been playing in, from anything from sort of health apps to digital health to artificial intelligence.
Perfect. Well, so that leads me nicely on to my next question, which is sort of where our paths crossed a few years ago, where we ended up working together with a whole bunch of other folk around developing BS 30440, which is the UK standard, or a UK standard for validating AI in healthcare. What's the background to the standard, and how did it come about from your perspective?
Okay. Interesting background to this one, actually.
Yeah.
So we were already aware that AI was going to be a big...
And what year is
so
this?
This is about 2018. So this is all pre-COVID.
Yep.
Government Office for Science organised an event to look at the benefits of AI in healthcare and how we would address some of the challenges.
Yeah.
And it was quite a big meeting, I seem to remember, probably 100, 150 people in the room. So a lot of people there.
Yeah.
And it broke down into two big challenges. Number one was, where's the data going to come from? But then the second part was the regulatory piece. How are we going to regulate this stuff? Off the back of that, I had some conversations with MHRA and their director for devices at the time. Really starting to think, is there something we could do around standards, landscaping, standards mapping, or looking at potential solutions for AI as a medical technology? So John Wilkinson, who was the director then, was really keen on doing something. First of all, because he wanted to see the UK advancing artificial intelligence in healthcare and the regulation of it. But also, we were in the early stages of sort of manoeuvring towards moving out of the EU as well.
Yes, yeah.
And John at the time and his division, they'd just been shut out of all of the discussions around the new EU MDR.
From the
European Commission, yeah.
Yeah.
So he was keen to explore whether we could have relationships with other countries as well. So with some support from MHRA, we started to look at what might a future standards landscape look like in terms of artificial intelligence as a medical technology. Starting with the basis that there are already several standards there, or a suite of sort of a dozen or so standards that regulate software as a medical device.
Yeah.
So what extra needs to be done for artificial intelligence? He was ever so keen that we did some work directly with the US, because he wanted to, as a UK regulator, he was keen to work with the FDA in the
Especially
States.
since we've been kicked out of
Absolutely.
European conversations.
Yeah, so it was ominous. It was looking ominous at the time. So, so hitting a bit of a brick wall in Europe.
Yeah.
Less of a problem on the standard side, but he was really keen to forge some relationships with the US.
Okay.
Now, we already have a close relationship with a US standards development organization called AMI, which is the Association for Advancement of Medical Instrumentation. In the US, it's a slightly different standard system. So you haven't got one body like BSI. You haven't got a BSI that covers everything. You've got one organization at the top, and then a lot of the standardizations devolved across several other organizations.
What's the organization at the top?
ANSI is the main member of ISO. So they are the chief standards body.
And what does that stand for? Sorry, putting you on the spot.
Yeah, you are putting me on the spot. I'd have to check
American
that one out.
something.
Yeah. It has got, the A is for American.
Okay, yes,
Unlike AMI. But so anyway, AMI is a group that looks specifically at medical technology and digital health.
Gotcha.
So we already have a relationship with them. We've done some joint events and conferences together. We got together and we thought, what can we do? And what we ended up doing was a couple of workshops, both sides of the Atlantic. So I think we started in the UK, and this must have been the back end of 2018, because we managed to get all of this in just before the pandemic struck.
Yeah.
So workshops in UK and US with a different set of stakeholders. So from the UK side, we had some medical device manufacturers, digital health specialists, but also people from the NHS,
Yeah.
policymakers, regulators, and so on. The sorts of people that would, academia as well, the sorts of people that would constitute a regular BSI committee.
And how's that different to what would happen stateside?
US, they've got a lot more big medtech on their committees, but probably it's probably the industry side that dominates it a bit more.
Understood. Yeah.
So they have some professional bodies, so slightly different makeups.
Yeah.
We probably have less of a big industry here.
Yeah.
But they're probably more dominated by that.
Fine.
I'd say. So it was quite a good coming
Mix.
together.
Yeah.
And we started to explore what would be the criteria we would need to look at from a standards perspective.
Yeah.
So thinking about it, it was some of the risks. So, AI, how do you deal with the explainability piece?
Yeah.
How do you deal with the autonomous nature of artificial intelligence? We were working to a set of rules in the medical devices sector where any software could be checked to make sure that if you gave it a sum, it would always give the right answer, the same answer every time. But how do you do that with something that can potentially change in real time, and the output it gives you today could be different 6 months down the road? So those were the big challenges, and so that was kind of our starting point for doing.
And then for those who don't know, and I think actually someone's given us a correction on what ANSI stands for. The American National Standards Institute.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. There you go.
So
Thanks,
slap
Graham,
for not knowing that.
Yes. Yeah. The okay, for those who don't know sort of the high level process of how some of these standards, which for a lot of the software medical device people, they'll be very familiar with things like, ISO 14971 and the quality management system standards. How do you go from that sort of problem statement around, hey, look, AI is coming, there's challenges around explainability, data, and all these other aspects. How does that transform then into a document like BS?
Into a document.
Yeah.
So, with medical device standards, there's a mix of horizontals, so standards that are applicable to everything, such as risk management, quality management, and so on. And then in some instances, we have very, very specific standards around how do you build a particular product? How do you build an AI solution and regulate it as a medical device? So it is that mix of horizontal with vertical. There's also a piece, and we considered this very early, around what's going on with generic AI and thinking about good practice around that. So how are people addressing trustworthiness, bias, risks with AI?
When you say generic AI, what do you mean specifically?
AI used outside of healthcare.
Fine. So, okay, got you. Sorry.
Yeah. So if you think, a good example is everyone will be familiar with the quality management system standard ISO 9001.
Yeah.
That's used universally across lots of different companies, businesses, sectors. In the medical devices domain, we have a specific medical device version of that that's written in the right language for that industry, for that sector. So essentially, it's the same principles, but it's written in a way that
relevant to the context
can understand. And this is the thing we wanted to do with artificial intelligence: is don't go and reinvent the wheel. Don't write something and then you find the transport sector with autonomous vehicles are doing something entirely different later on. So it's making sure we've got that consistent approach.
Yeah. Well, so that can be one of the it's not challenges, I guess criticisms is often vendors, commissioners, whoever might often complain about, why do we need another standard for this? Or is this not duplicating? So I guess from your perspective, what was the value add and with this particular work, and how did you make sure that it was consistent with stuff that was happening in other sectors?
So first of all, healthcare was seen as one of the early adopters of AI. So it was a natural place to start, probably along with autonomous vehicles, to be honest. So that was a good starting point. When we develop a standard, we make sure not only do we bring together a group of experts that can come together with different backgrounds, but with the same challenge of solving a particular problem, and to agree consensus. But we also look at liaising with other committees to ensure that we're getting a consistent approach to how we're approaching these challenges. So there's quite a big liaison network when you look at standards, both at a national level and international level, in terms of where can you seek input and guidance from other places. So that's really how it started to come about.
And then the interesting challenge is, so in one of my other hats in the NHS, I run a fellowship program.
Yeah.
Because one of the big challenges we have in the country and probably internationally is we don't have a lot of people who understand the multidisciplinary aspects of medical AI.
Yeah.
The AI applied to medicine and healthcare. So in the development of this standard, how did you go about getting the right people in the room to feed
Yeah.
into it? And were there any gaps?
Okay, so we actually wrote two separate standards,
Mm.
and the first one was probably the easier of the two. So that was a piece of work looking at risk management of medical devices that were AI enabled or contained artificial intelligence or machine learning. So in some respects, that was the easier one to go for because we already had a standing committee in the UK that covered risk management of medical devices. So therefore, taking a portion of that group and
Yeah.
bringing in some AI experts from, say, the generic committee or other places
Yeah.
really helped to move that forward. We actually partnered with AMI in the US on that one and did a joint UK-US national standard at the same time. So we wrote it in a way where we were writing a British standard in the UK, and in the US we were writing a US standard, but actually it was just one document.
One document,
And
yeah.
we agreed to try and, as much as possible, produce something together.
Yeah.
And that was interesting because our processes don't quite align, but
Yeah.
we got through that. But always with the caveat that if we wanted to go off in totally different directions,
Yeah.
then we could just separate and pull it apart. So in the end, that works, and that's still used as a case study internally in terms of accelerating innovation, because if you take a standardization idea into ISO, just through the nature of calling big international meetings,
Yeah.
it takes a long time to do, and we managed to move quicker.
Yeah.
So that was the first piece, but I think for that one, the groups and the experts were already in place.
Yes.
When we got to doing the second piece of work, which was just a UK-based standard, so a validation framework aimed at the UK healthcare system and predominantly the NHS, we did have to start from scratch. We had an incredibly good convener at the time who, along with others, had sort of come up with this idea that we really needed to do something in that space. His name's Haris Hussain, so
Yes.
he's involved in some. Well, he works as a consultant, but he works as a non-exec director for an NHS trust,
Yeah.
and for MHRA as well.
Yes.
So he's
Yeah,
really,
yeah.
really well placed to look at this.
Yeah.
So he went out of his way to develop an expert group. So we brought together about 20, 25 different people with very, very diverse backgrounds. So we made sure we had technology developers and medtech organizations and suppliers in there. We made sure we had people from NHS trusts and then from across all of the devolved regions as well. So we weren't just focusing on England, for example. We brought in academia. So where are the academic institutions that are looking at these challenges in healthcare? A number of policymakers. So we had, MHRA as a regulator. We had NICE, but we also had some of the think tanks as well. So quite a decent sized group.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And then what he started to do is, first of all, sort of collaborate to think about if we were going to develop a validation framework, what would be all the things we would need to think about.
Yeah.
And then broke his panel down into smaller groups, almost task and finish groups, to go off and explore particular problems and come back.
And then it's been a few years now since that work's been completed.
So it's just under 2 years. I think it was July 2023 we published, so it's coming up to its second anniversary.
And so I guess in the grand scheme of things, particularly compared to some of the other standards which are a bit more foundational, relatively new in the world, have you seen it being used in practice? Is it being adopted by developers and NHS organizations?
It is. So because of the nature of our standards,
Yeah.
they're heavily used by industry
Yeah.
and the supplier side. So we've seen a very, very strong uptake and interest in that area. It's worth also noting that you can't just measure standards usage in the number of downloads. We do have single copy transactions.
Yeah.
But actually a lot of organizations subscribe to our content. So they will say, I want your healthcare module.
Yes. Yeah.
And
So
they dip in and out of it over a 12-month period. So there are different ways standards are supplied. So the industry side has been very big. So to the level that, if we were doing a revision, it would get sort of a decent level of marketing interest and marketing attention
Yeah.
if we were to update it in the future. The challenge I really wanted to solve at the time was, in our dealings with the NHS, we have some good contact with the NHS, but it tends to be at the sort of university hospital level, the research level, the teaching hospitals.
Yeah.
And I suspect we're missing about sort of 80–90% of the NHS, the
Yeah.
big general hospitals, who don't regularly come into contact
No.
with BSI and standards. And that was the bit we looked at addressing over 2024.
And how do you address something like that? Because that's often a challenge with all kinds of innovation, where you have sort of the ivory tower effect, where you get a lot of attention, whether it's funding or resources, being concentrated at institutions like my own, like Guy's and St Thomas's. But when in reality, the majority of healthcare is not delivered by those academic teaching hospitals. It's delivered by bread and butter district generals.
Yeah.
So how can you get them more involved in this kind of activity?
So we were fortunate at the time in that we were running a number of internal impact projects. So
Okay.
I managed to get hold of some resources to undertake that during 2024. But I guess the key thing we did is we went out and engaged with the NHS
Yeah.
a lot more than we would have done if we just looked at organic growth.
Yeah.
So I imagine if we had done nothing in 2024, you would have got the supplier market discovering the standard, and probably very little in the NHS.
Fine.
So we did a number of things. We ran a number of interactive workshops with people we knew, and then often with other people they had suggested. So that managed to reach out to about 30 or 40 different NHS trusts.
Oh, wow.
Which was good. But so, for us, I should say trusts and health boards, so this is across the UK.
Got you.
And we made sure the devolved regions were in there. So that was a good starting point. We also did a campaign later in the year to target medical physicists, for example, and sort of anyone working in clinical AI.
Yes.
And that managed to get outreach to a number of organisations that, sort of traditionally we hadn't been in contact with.
Yeah, yeah.
So again, that worked quite well. And then there was a second piece where we picked one particular hospital and did a deep dive into what were doing. So
who was that? Tell us more about that.
it was I won't name the hospital,
Okay,
but it was a teaching hospital.
Okay.
Working on radiology.
Okay.
And they were doing a comparison between different algorithms for
Interesting.
on X-rays, on chest X-rays.
Fine.
So they were looking at doing that and making a comparison. So almost trying to make a decision on which vendor they would go for.
Yeah.
And then looking to see if they could use the standard to help make that decision.
Yes, yeah.
Which was quite interesting. So they came up with a number of challenges they found. So for me, that was a really interesting piece. Sort of thinking about what are the big problems you have, what are the big headaches,
Yeah.
and actually how does your relationship with your vendor work in terms of solving and addressing that. So I guess the headline that came out of that is, if you look at the requirements in the standard,
Yeah.
all of the requirements are aimed at the supplier. So they're all on the supplier. All the way through it says the supplier shall do this.
Yes.
There's nothing that says the hospital has got to do anything. But what we tried to measure was, do the requirements in this broadly answer the questions you would ask? And I think they sort of said, 90% of it is probably spot on.
Yeah.
There's probably another 10% where we'd like a bit more evidence, but it's not insurmountable. And I think there might have just been one question in there, maybe relating to sustainability or something like that, which is an important issue, which was something they hadn't thought about.
Yeah.
So overall, a pretty good alignment.
Fantastic. There's a question someone asked. What is the number of the standard referred to here, please? It's BS 30440.
Spot on. Yeah, correct.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Just zooming out a little bit then. So it's been out there for a couple of years. You've done a lot of engagement work and some deep dive with one organization. How does BS 30440 fit in the international picture? Obviously, the provenance of a lot of this work and thinking happened in collaboration with Amy in the US. Has it become a cause for increasing convergence or divergence, particularly, I guess, US versus UK or US versus Europe?
Yeah, good question. So from a technology perspective, suppliers of technology are generally selling into multiple markets. And, we've experienced that ourselves through, some of the work we've done with our our clients who use our notified body services, for example, the vast majorities are looking to access multiple markets. They will go to, they will have a strategy in terms of where's the best place to go first and build from there. So that's where the international standards in particular are really, really helpful, because you have regulations at a sovereign level, albeit we start to see convergence between regulators and trying to follow the same principles.
Yeah.
And certainly MHRA now that we're out of Europe, MHRA are doing a huge piece of work to engage with other regulators and look at the convergence of medical device regulations. Standards have a role in terms of supporting regulations.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important in this space. So any area where you've got high-risk products where you need to protect the public interest, often you get this strong link between standards, so the good practice of how you do something, versus the regulation that spells out what you need to do.
Got you.
To give you an example of that, if you look at risk management in regulations, if you look at the EU medical device regulations, it will talk about what you need to do in terms of having a risk register and how you manage risk. If you go to the international standard for risk management for medical devices, it expands that process out. So it gives you a set of requirements that if you follow, you're going to have a fairly robust risk management process that everybody will agree with. Now, the key thing then, particularly in Europe and the UK, is there's a process called harmonisation, where the standards have been precisely linked to the regulation. So those standards will have a table within them that will highlight particular clauses within the standard. And if you're following those clauses, it provides presumption of conformity that you are meeting particular parts of the regulation. So as a manufacturer, that's a really logical way, really powerful way of demonstrating to a notified body or a regulator or to a client that you're selling to that you have met that part of the regulation. The UK follows the same system as a legacy, albeit we've got an outdated regulation now. So we still have what we call designated standards in the UK.
What's the outdated regulation?
So that's the old medical device directive that was implemented in the early noughties, around about 2002, I think. Yeah, so since Brexit happened and we came out of the EU, there's been a new EU MDR, which does apply in Northern Ireland, but doesn't apply in the rest of the UK. So we've got as a UK national standards body, we have to look at what happens in Northern Ireland as well. Same conundrum for MHRA. We're actually working to 2 regulations at the moment. But the good news is with a common set of standards. So
it makes it slightly more straightforward.
Standards are global. And then elsewhere, you'll see the same thing. So maybe not the same precise link, but if you go to the US, they have a long list, maybe 1,100 global consensus standards that they use and they like to see manufacturers using to demonstrate conformity to the regulations. So so it's a very, very strong link there. And as MHRA start to move forward with new UK regulations, it's obviously something we want to be incredibly aligned to.
So for I guess UK innovators, it sounds like there could be a pathway to demonstrate sort of global readiness, or at least broader international readiness, by aligning with things like BS 30440 and potentially other international standards as they become harmonized.
Exactly. So and it's interesting because I guess the majority of the medtech and digital health standards we have are international standards. With some of the more recent work we've done that either at a national level or just in partnership with one other country. But I think for me, the end game is always, the place we want to get to is having global consensus standards, so internationalizing all of this. So the work we've done on BS 30440, we're not precious about keeping that solely as a British standard. We're more than happy to offer that up to international standards organizations such as ISO as content for the future. We did it with the risk management piece, so the piece we developed jointly with AMI. We developed a British standard, they had an American standard. That's already being used as a basis for a new ISO standard,
Oh, fantastic.
which is great.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And the same potentially with BS 30440. I mean, interestingly, when I've looked at the downloads, I think something like 20% of all of the downloads have come from overseas anyway.
Brilliant.
So
Yeah, yeah.
US is strong again. A lot of the big European countries as well would be the main markets.
Fantastic. I've got a couple of more questions in the chat. So one is from Jesus. Hi, Rob. He's one of my clinical AI fellows, so I actually know him. His interest is in post-market surveillance and validation as well. One question he's always had in regards to standardization is whether hospitals/institutions should also standardize processes, particularly as it pertains to the data we validate with. I find that with every project, we use different data, ground truth in different ways. So it's hard to compare products like to like, a bit like what the exercise you did with the other organization. Do you think even the validation cohort should be standardized in this regard? Should every hospital have or be equipped with validation cohorts for this purpose? So a technical question, but fundamentally, I guess the question is to your point, BS 30440 only addresses vendors, and the reality is that at the provider end, there is not a lot of standardization, even within the same organization. What should providers be doing?
Yeah, so it makes me think of a good friend of ours, Danny Reuter.
Yes, yeah.
I remember when he was involved in this work very early on, one of the key messages he gave to me was some of this technology now is so complicated that you can't have one single person who knows the answer to everything. So therefore, you've got to have a really strong multidisciplinary team that can come together and be able to deal with all of this. So, it's like having a data expert and a technology expert and a clinical expert and so on. And others that can think about how is this actually going to be deployed in the real world. So I think with BS 30440, we've gone some way towards that. It's just that we probably have a bias towards selling, sort of providing standards content to the industry side. And one of the reasons we did this impact work last year with the NHS was if you don't bring the NHS on the same journey, we're never going to get to a good place.
But then, so whose role is it then to maybe not regulate NHS providers, but at least set out standards in terms of processes that they should be following when it comes to evaluating vendors and testing like-for-like products?
Yeah, so interestingly, right, again, just before COVID, we were having some discussions with some of the other regulators. So obviously, if you can imagine my role, the closest regulator to me is MHRA, for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But over the past sort of 10 years or so, we have worked with other regulators. I think one of the key ones for me was the Care Quality Commission in England.
Yeah.
Because they have started to look at some of these challenges.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of things that have happened. So first of all, the regulators, particularly in England, have got a bit closer to start to think about sort of complex technologies and artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And I've started to think about what can we do to make sure we don't drop the ball.
Yeah.
So that, let's say there's God forbid, but if there's an awful problem caused by an artificial intelligence enabled solution, who's at fault? Who gets struck off? Is it the doctor? Is it the AI solution? Is it the fault of the institution?
Yeah.
And all of those organizations are regulated, but in very, very different ways.
Yes.
So I think there is a piece about, first of all, coming together, understanding what's reasonable and not dropping the ball.
Yeah.
With the Care Quality Commission, who I think are quite advanced on some of this stuff, and certainly still at the events I go to, there is representation from them there. They came up with some really interesting comments through some of the research they did.
When was this?
This was, again, pre-COVID, so probably about 2018, 2019.
Because they ran a regulatory sandbox, I remember the CQC did.
Tom Stocker was the chap running it. So, he did a really good job of that. And some of those discussions are still ongoing, but I remember an example he showed was, you had an AI solution that would give a yes or no answer. So, does the patient have this condition, yes or no?
Yeah.
It's fairly black or white. Then he was looking at another solution which claimed it could predict, I think, sort of 60 different types of disease.
Yeah.
And you sort of think, oh, great, that's fantastic if you can get someone to do that. But then he said, but how realistic is it? How realistic is it for a clinician who's, working day in, day out to remember what those 60 things are?
Yeah,
and
what they're
exactly
referred
what
to.
it can and can't do, and where are all the boundaries and stuff like that. what happens if it starts flagging up, potential problems, potential illnesses, potential disease?
Yeah,
And actually some of those are false positives, and suddenly your workload's increased
exactly.
several times
Yeah, yeah.
because you're checking a lot of things out that routinely you may not have done before. So that was an interesting take on it, and I think seeing it from a different regulator's view is very interesting. So I think that's something I'd like to do more of in this
Yes.
space. Sort of can we have standards that start to reach over into the service quality side, for example, with CQC and potentially with professional regulators?
Yeah.
Probably some way off, but if we can gain some recognition in that space, then I think that's a good thing.
No, that makes a lot of sense. We've got a couple of more questions. One's from Dr. James Lees, who's from Southampton. He's asking, is there any guidance or support available? This is quite a direct question. Support available for an NHS institution that may consider using the BSI AI standard? James's teams reviewed the standard and came to the conclusion that it looks like a considerable amount of extra work when they already have an ISO 13485 QMS for medical device software manufacture. Yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. For me, again, the standard is aimed
Yeah,
at the supplier first of all, but then how do you bring that to life for for the clinician?
yeah.
I think that's a really valid point.
What if the institution, because I know James's team relatively well, what if the institution is building the AI?
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay, so that's the other example as
yeah,
well. So for me, the key thing about this standard is it goes beyond just that regulatory piece. So
yeah,
standards like 13485 are used specifically for medical device regulation,
yeah.
and the special case, the exemption in the regulation that you can build
In-house,
technologies
yeah,
in-house,
yeah,
the in-house exemption. But for me, this is starting to cover, the standard covers things that go beyond just that regulatory piece.
yeah,
So that's the other thing we should be clear about here. Some of the things that are covered in BS 30440 go beyond the regulations.
yeah,
It goes beyond the regulations, but it also covers products that aren't necessarily medical devices as well.
yes,
So it is broader in that sense, and we're not focusing on something that absolutely has to be a medical device and within the scope of medical device regulation. To answer that question directly, some of the research we did last year with the teaching hospitals and other institutions,
yeah.
I think we want to draw that out and get a journal article published.
Okay, fantastic.
And again, we have got one trust that has used the standard for comparison, and they've written up a nice 2-page flyer, so that's probably a good place to start. And we are going to be publishing that. I've got permission to do that
Oh,
recently,
fantastic.
actually. So we are going to be putting that out quite soon, and happy to
Very
share that
exciting.
with you so we can sort of
That'd be awesome.
evangelize it a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah. It's to be honest, it was surprising when the standard first got published, and because it was such a big effort in getting it to a state of publication, and I slightly had forgotten about it until I got an outreach from a vendor, and they said, "Could you tell me more about this standard?" And I was like, "Sure, but how have you come across this?" And they said, "Oh, we're going through this procurement process with this trust in the north, and they've asked for it in their
Yeah.
tender specification." And I was like, "Oh wow, I didn't know that the engagement with the standard had progressed to that stage," and that was really encouraging. And then the other story I've already told you before is when I was talking to a U.S. institution in Texas, and I was just trying to understand, how they do deployment and evaluation of AI technology, and they said, "Oh well, we've come across a little document from the UK." BS 30440, and I was like, "Oh, great, yeah, super familiar with that." So you do see healthcare institutions getting benefit out of it, whether it's by requiring it of vendors or just using it to inform their internal processes.
I also felt that when we were running workshops and trying to engage with people, it wasn't a difficult ask to engage with
No,
clinicians and healthcare staff.
yeah,
We did find that you know quite an easy route in. People do want to talk about it. Particularly one area we found with digital pathology,
yes.
really keen to talk to us. So
Oh, interesting.
where they started doing a lot of this work, we were getting feedback saying, "Oh, if we'd had this 3 years ago, it would have been so easy." So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
we worked as hard as we could on the standard, but even prior to that, people were starting to think about this and
Yes,
how do we do it. So
exactly.
yeah, some good examples there.
I've got another question from Graham King. Really good question. So there's there's already other standards and methodologies emerging for validation. There's the medical algorithmic audit, which I think is
Yeah.
published by the Birmingham Group.
Yep.
There's also guidelines for academic studies, publications like Decide AI and
Mm.
Tripod. How are buyers and suppliers meant to choose which standards to apply to a particular procurement, evaluation, or validation exercise?
Yeah, really good point.
Yeah.
So I guess the way we try to work, what's the unique selling point of BSI? So number one, it's the connection to international standards.
Yeah.
So if we develop something at a UK level, at a national level, we can then, if we can demonstrate that can work, we can use that as a seed for, excuse me, for international standards.
Mm.
Secondly, it's that sort of broader consensus piece. Now, organisations like Birmingham, for example, we work closely with them because actually
This is Alistair Dennis's group.
Alistair's group, yeah. So
Yeah.
the research and activities they're doing,
Yeah.
those can often be things that we then start to build as national standards, as international standards. So it's a really important route for feeding what we're doing. When we developed BS 30440, we looked and researched a lot of the literature and guidelines that were already out there.
Yeah.
And then put it through a BSI process. So you have got that rigor where you've got people with different perspectives, but all trying to solve the same problem,
Yeah.
looking at the same thing. So yeah, so I guess we're not making this a competition,
No.
but we do, we do reach out a lot. We engage with universities and
Yeah.
the NHS and other institutions actively to bring all of this together.
Yeah. I guess that's what I don't think it's any one's responsibility, perhaps a group responsibility, which is to sort of just clarify the space and
Yeah.
when and what is the value of using certain standards and guidelines over others.
Yeah.
Because like so some of these, like Greg mentioned, like Decide AI, Tripod, are for academic studies, and most procurements are not academic exercises. And so in that scenario, you might use something else,
Correct.
or vice versa. Just looking at the time, we've got probably the last 5-10 minutes. A couple of things I want to touch on. So one is engagement. So when I engaged with the BSI over this work, I had no idea what that was like, or that was even possible. I sort of got roped into something, and I was like, "Oh, this is a very interesting conversation to be part of." So, what would you say to someone, whether they're a startup like Newton's Tree, a clinician like myself, a policymaker, who, or particularly people who think standards are just paperwork? Why should they engage? As the first question.
Yeah, why should they engage? So I think it's something. It's a place where you can add something really transformational. So you've been fortunate enough to be involved in a project that is making steps forward and is helping
Yeah.
sort of solve a problem, solve a challenge. So I think it's being able to give something back to your sector. I think it's also the people that you meet as well. So you will meet other individuals that sit on the other side of the fence. So you will meet suppliers, you will meet academics, you will meet clinicians,
Yeah.
all coming together to solve one particular challenge. So I think it's good from that point. And I think it also gives you an insight in terms of how people are developing and trying to build an understanding of what we think good practice is, what good looks like.
Yeah.
So that's why I would encourage people. Standardization can be daunting. So we have a catalogue of about 37,000 standards or
Wow.
something ridiculous like that. We publish new or revised standards about 2,500 every year. So it is a bit of a sausage factory with lots and lots of content falling off it. Now, some of that is content that is being maintained. So it's being updated.
Yeah.
And often we do need people that have got that background across a whole program of work. So
Yeah.
experience does count for a lot.
Yeah.
But what I would say is in some of these innovative or transformational areas, it's a really, really good place to have a go and to start out. We have programs that are aimed at attracting young professionals to standardization, and we've had some really good successes with those.
Yeah.
But I think if you're sort of time limited,
Yeah.
and you want to find a particular project to go and work on, by all means, we can help people with that as well, who just want to be able to contribute in one very, very specific area rather than a whole entire program of work. So more than happy to have those discussions with anyone.
So yeah,
interested.
more procedural question is then how do people get involved in contributing to BSI committees? Is there like a process?
There is. So we have standing committee, about 1,200 standing committees that cover all sorts of different subjects.
Yeah.
Probably about 20 or so in the healthcare domain. To join a committee, I think there is an application form for it, but the main thing to do is, if you're working for a private organisation, is get a nomination through a professional body.
Okay.
So if you think of the big medtech or digital
Like
health,
AXREM or things like that?
ACTREM,
Yeah.
ABHI, those sorts
Those
of
guys.
organisations.
Yeah.
So they will nominate onto our committees.
Okay.
If you're working in the public sector, so if you're working in the NHS
Yeah.
or academia, or for a public sector organisation, then we can just co-opt or bring those organisations in. Our committee managers can advise areas where we need more diversity or where we've got gaps, or even good places to start. A really good example at the moment is there's a big medical electrical standard, the 60601 series.
Oh, yes.
The main part of that is under revision at the moment.
Okay.
We've done a lot of engagement to try and bring new people in, because we've got a group who fully understand it,
Yeah.
and understand the processes. But actually, that's a really good time to refresh when we're
Get some fresh eyes.
starting to change something.
Yeah.
So we want our committees to be diverse. We want new people coming in all the time.
Yeah.
We've time limited a lot of the chair terms, so you can't just carry on being chairman forever and ever and ever. Maximum of 9 years now, so three times 3-year terms, and then that's it, and we move on. So it's good to have that sort of that churn and that turnover.
Fantastic. I just want to ask one more question about the future and what's on the horizon. What is on the horizon for standards in medical AI space? I think AI, particularly over the past sort of 2 years, the sort of the Chat GPT era, which didn't exist. COVID didn't exist. Chat GPT didn't exist when we started this work around medical AI, but now you have generative AI, foundation models, agentic AI in healthcare. What's on the horizon for standards in this space?
Okay. So specifically for BS 30440,
No, just in general.
or anything. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot more that needs to be done in the large language models and
Yes.
that sort of space. The sort of the exciting end of it.
Yeah.
I always call it. There's a lot more we need to do in that space. That's still moving.
Yeah.
And also, we've got the EU AI Act as well, where we're working on part of that as well, and the standards that support that area. That's an area where we have to resource it heavily, so that the work we're doing in standardisation can actually keep pace with the innovation.
Yes. Yeah.
I think there's a lot more where we can take sort of UK homegrown standards to the international arena, and thinking of the way we do that. So, we can throw these into ISO, but what are we actually going to do to mature, to do that in a way that we're not going to have something that's out of date by the time we get to publishing it. So, what are the steps to take to make that go through in a fast track way that reflects the sort of the rapidly transforming nature of this topic. The other piece we're seeing a lot at the moment is there seems to be a lot of interest now within the NHS of this sort of bridging the gap between what a supplier does and what the NHS wants in terms of its policies.
In what way are you seeing that? What does that look like?
I think it's the NHS wanting to talk to us and other organisations in terms of the standards and the regulation and maybe sort of conformity assessment and assurances that are out there. So
is that because they're becoming more savvier?
I think it's partly that, and I think it's also how can we just work in a more productive and coordinated way.
Yes. Yeah.
So we've seen a lot of that in probably the last 9 to 12 months. It's been a very recent thing.
Yeah.
But I think someone estimated to me, so particularly where AI has been regulated as a medical technology, so it has a CE mark or a UK VA mark. By the time the NHS comes to deploying it, how many of the questions have actually been answered by the fact it's been through that regulatory process?
Yeah.
And what's the delta? What's the gap that still needs to be addressed?
Yeah.
Now, some people have said to me, thousands of hours spent a year almost starting again and going through the same process with the vendor, where a CE mark means some of it's been done, not all of it. And that's the key thing with the British standard we've written.
Yeah.
You haven't done everything.
Yes.
You still need to have that vendor provider conversation and a full understanding. But what are the things that we can just tick off straight away? That's done. And I think that's going to be an exciting area where potentially we can get involved in some more standards awareness type activities.
Perfect. Rob, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us and for sharing your insights. I think it's clear, I mean, hopefully it's clearer to the audience that standards aren't a barrier to innovation. They're actually, I often think about it as like a bridge or like a highway to having trusted and safer adoption of AI technology. But yeah, thank you so much. Thanks guys for listening in, and thanks for the questions, and we'll see you next time.